This episode contains distressing themes and descriptions of violence. This podcast is intended for a mature audience. Listener caution is advised. The sun was setting and there was a bitter chill in the air as Carlo Mogano made the journey home. He was looking forward to having dinner with his wife and 2 sons. As Carlo approached the house, he found one of his children sitting outside. The boy explained to his father why he was lingering in the cold. 14-year-old Adrian had been waiting for over an hour. He couldn't get inside because the doors were locked and no one was answering. Using his key, Carlo walked through the front door and immediately began looking for his wife. He went into the dining room. It took a moment for Carlo to comprehend what he was seeing. Welcome to Season 9, Episode 32 of They Walk Among Us, a podcast dedicated to UK true crime. By January 1954, 45-year-old Carlo Mogano and his wife, 44-year-old Penelope Phyllis, had been married for 23 years. They made their vows at St. Thomas Roman Catholic Church on the Isle of Wight. Penelope was one of 7 children in her family who were born and raised in Gurnard on the island. Carlo was also from the Isle of Wight and raised alongside his 2 sisters. His mother was English, but Carlo was named after his Italian father. He was working as a mechanic and driver for a Ventnor-based coach firm when he met Penelope. A few years later, the couple moved to the Midlands, settling down in Coventry. Then came their 2 sons, Michael and Adrian. The family survived the Second World War, but their home on Radford Road didn't. It was destroyed in a bombing. The Moganos temporarily moved back to the Isle of Wight, believing it to be safer during that time, although after the war ended they returned to Coventry. In 1951, the family settled in a middle-class neighbourhood, buying a brick-faced terrace property on the corner of Holland Road. With a large garden which the couple enjoyed tending to and an open green space directly outside, it was the perfect place to raise their sons. The Moganos were described as a close-knit, traditional family. Penelope worked at home caring for the boys, while Carlo was employed as an inspector at a nearby car factory, Daimler Co. Limited. Their oldest son, 16-year-old Michael, had left school to become an apprentice hairdresser, and their youngest, 14-year-old Adrian, was attending Bab Lake School. Carlo and Penelope also shared a passion. They were well known in local old-time dance circles and often participated in competitions at the Savoy Cinema ballroom near their home. Penelope's sister later explained that her sibling had been in pain for years despite having surgery. At her wit's end, she was willing to try anything, and around 1948 a doctor made a suggestion. Penelope's sister said, "She suffered with a very bad back for many years, and on one occasion was in plaster for 3 months. The doctor suggested she took up dancing as it might help her condition to improve." The Mogano sons also enjoyed dancing, and Adrian was due to take a dancing exam in the coming weeks. A friend of the family, Mrs. E.M. Alston, told the Portsmouth Evening News, "There was not a happier couple, and they never quarrelled with anyone. Mrs. Mogano had many friends. They were both very popular and friendly with everybody." January 18, 1954 started as a typical Monday for the Moganos. Carlo and Michael left the house early to go to work, and Adrian, who was not far behind, went to school. Meanwhile, Penelope began tending to the chores. She was dressed in her house clothes and had an apron tied around her waist. At lunchtime, Carlo and Adrian came home to eat with Penelope. She served the meal, which included carved slices of meat from a coal joint she had prepared. After they finished lunch, Penelope's husband and son left. Carlo headed out at 1:45 and Adrian left 15 minutes later. Penelope was again on her own in the home. When Adrian finished school, he had an errand to run. He collected some laundry and carried it home, arriving at about 4:50 p.m. Unusually, he found he couldn't get inside. Both doors were locked and he didn't have his key. When he knocked and called for his mother through the letterbox, Adrian got no reply, so he waited until his father finished work. Carlo got home around an hour later, and they went inside together expecting to find Penelope preparing dinner. The house was quiet and nothing seemed out of place. Penelope was meticulously tidy, and she always had dinner ready by the time Carlo came home, but she had not set the table. In the dining room, Carlo could see his wife slumped on an easy chair next to the fireplace. As he got closer and could properly see Penelope's face, he noticed that she had been badly beaten. Blood was spattered on the wall next to her. She was still wearing her house clothes, and resting on top of her apron was a 12-inch curved carving knife with a bone handle, the same one she had used to slice the meat for lunch. No signs of forced entry were discovered, and there did not appear to be evidence of a struggle throughout the home. A fresh pair of underwear was noted on a chair in the living room. It appeared as though Penelope intended to wash using the kitchen sink and then dry in front of the fire before getting dressed into fresh clothes. She hadn't managed to take that wash, and she wasn't undressed. A cigarette had burned out on the carpet. A full line of ash suggested it had hardly been smoked, if at all. Penelope was a smoker, but it was possible the intruder was careless and dropped it. Penelope Mogano's body was removed from the family home, and a post-mortem was carried out by Professor J.M. Webster, director of the West Midlands Forensic Science Laboratory. Professor Webster concluded that Penelope had been struck at least 12 times with a hammer before her body was mutilated. Investigators thought that the assailant might have been injured. Penelope could have picked up the knife to defend herself before she was disarmed and killed by her attacker. Professor Webster said, "Obviously, she had very grave injuries. She was fully clothed. I found she had injuries of 3 types. The total number of injuries she had was more than 25. The first type were defensive injuries. They were to her hands, which she had obviously held up to protect herself. She had cuts or wounds made by an instrument such as a knife. These were in the main to her mouth, severing not merely the lips but cutting the tongue in 2. The third group of injuries were more serious. They were inflicted by a blunt instrument such as a hammer. So great was the damage that she had no floor to the base of the skull. This had caused considerable damage to the brain, and she was almost bled white. This woman had been a healthy woman. There was no evidence whatsoever of carnal assault." Professor Webster believed that Penelope Mogano's death was caused by a combination of shock, skull fracture, and brain injury. Chief Constable of Coventry Police Edward Pendleton referred to the murder as a hate killing due to the frenzied nature in which Penelope had been attacked. Extra help was needed in the case. Officers from Scotland Yard were called in to assist the investigation as house-to-house visits were undertaken throughout Coventry. Carlo and his eldest son were questioned at the police station. Consideration was given to their welfare, with tea and sandwiches being supplied while the police examined the Mogano's lives with a fine-tooth comb. Carlo said Penelope, along with dancing, were the two loves of his life. He thought long and hard about who would despise his wife enough to kill her, but not a single soul came to mind. Penelope had been due to visit her friend's house at 3 p.m. but never arrived. The murder was believed to have occurred between 2:30 p.m. and 4:45 p.m. A witness eventually came forward who had been in the park which directly backed onto the Mogano household. For 50 minutes on the day of Penelope's murder between 3:20 and 4:10 p.m., the witness had been standing around in the cold while her dogs were off their leads running free in the park. With a perfect view of the comings and goings at 7 Holland Road, the witness couldn't recall seeing either a person or a vehicle leaving the property at that time. Penelope's sister told the Portsmouth Evening News. The family believes she was sitting in her chair resting her back when she was murdered. It is possible she was asleep. When the police searched the Mogano's home, the dress Penelope had laid out to wear was still on the bed. Appearances were important to her, and Penelope would be reluctant to open the front door dressed in house clothes she had been cleaning in, especially an apron. Haunting questions remained. How did the killer enter what was presumed to be a locked home, and how did they leave locking the door behind them? The Moganos were close friends with Sidney Worrell and his wife Evelyn. They lived just around the corner at 22 Bassett Road. Sidney organised and competed in dance competitions. His enterprise had grown to become a side business as over 100 people regularly attended classes. Sidney Worrell was also the Mogano's dance instructor. Perplexingly, a strange event occurred a few days before Penelope's murder. Someone had thrown a flaming cotton ball soaked in paraffin into the Worrell's pantry. Luckily, the fire was quickly extinguished. When investigators looked at the location of the fire, just 2 small scorch marks remained. It was assumed that the attempt to burn down the house was committed by someone involved in dancing competitions. The reason for this suspicion was timing. The small blaze had occurred shortly after the Worrells had won a silver medal in the Midland Area Old-Time Dance Finals. Penelope had been due to call at the Worrells' home on the day she was killed, which led investigators to suspect that her killer was someone Penelope knew through dancing. Coincidentally, there was another incident of attempted arson that happened a few months earlier. A rag soaked in paraffin had been set alight on the bonnet of Carlo Mogano's car. It occurred on November 5th. Carlo assumed it had been some sort of Guy Fawkes prank, but when his wife was murdered just over 10 weeks later, he worried that the family had been unwittingly targeted. Investigators could not rule out the possibility that it was a jealous woman or former dance partner. A witness who was near the scene of the crime on the day of the murder recalled seeing a woman nearby. Dance instructor Sidney Worrell said, "It may be that it is someone with a grudge, a hate against the old-time dance club I run, who murdered Mrs. Mogano and tried to set fire to my home." Carlo Mogano's former dance partner who lived close to the Mogano's home was brought in to participate in an identity parade with 9 other women. However, all were released without charge. While plainclothes detectives spoke with everyone at the dance hall, attendance had halved since Penelope's death. It was soon thereafter the police heard from a neighbour of the Moganos who had a strange interaction less than an hour before Penelope was believed to have been killed. 25-year-old Alice McBride was at home with her young children when a man called at the house at around 1:30 p.m. He was described as being between 20 and 30 years old, with an average build and thick dark curly hair. Alice noted that the unexpected guest was wearing a dark blue overcoat with leather patches on the cuffs and elbows over a red plaid shirt. He told Alice he was a meter inspector, and she let him into the house. She said, "He followed me through to the kitchen, and as I turned around he was close up behind me. He laughed and pointed to a switch on the wall saying, 'I want to see those switches. We're having lots of interference with TV sets around here.' For a few minutes he messed around with it and then came back into the middle of the room and stood with his hands on the table. He just stared at me, and it was then that I began to realize something was wrong with him. He stared so long it became embarrassing. He broke the silence by asking how many children I had, and if I knew of any digs roundabout. I explained that it was difficult to get lodgings in Coventry, and he said that he had only been present on his current job for 6 weeks and wanted to bring his wife to live in Coventry." Alice's 2-year-old son Stephen was beside her, and at one point the stranger spoke directly to the toddler. He asked me who lived in the house and asked Stephen where his daddy was and if he came home to dinner. It was just after this that his conversation took a different course, and eventually I told him to go. Patting Stephen on the head, he went out, gave a final look through the front window and made off at a fast pace towards the railway station at Camden. A man matching the description Alice provided had been reported to the police after he called at several homes in the area. He claimed to work for the electricity board. Addressing the development, Chief Constable Edward Pendleton said, "At 1:30 p.m. yesterday, this man called at a house in the same district in which the murdered woman lived and obtained admission on the pretext of examining electricity meters and switches on account of complaints of interference to television reception. Having been invited into the house, he made suggestions of an indecent nature to the woman in the house. During the past week, similar complaints have been made. His clothing was then described as a dirty khaki dust coat." More details followed. The man was remembered as having a full face with a fresh complexion. He spoke with a Cockney accent and was between 5'2" and 5'6" tall. The following day, a caller who was believed to be the same man was spotted in Birmingham. A spokesperson from what was then the Birmingham City Police said, "A man of similar description called at houses in Birmingham between 8:40 and 11:30 a.m. today. He asked to examine television and electric wiring. Householders should be on the alert for this man, and if they see him, try to notify the police in sufficient time to enable them to contact him immediately." As investigators tried to track down the bogus meter inspector, they continued to search for the item used in the killing. Detailing the murder weapon, Detective Superintendent Edmonds from Scotland Yard stated, "We believe that the article with which Mrs. Mogano was killed is a hammer, but it may be a spanner or other metallic object. We are looking for an object which could cause a circular injury about 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter." Locals were asked to search their gardens, and a pond in Radford Common was drained, but no sign of the weapon was found. In the days that followed, over 20 women reported the suspicious meter inspector calling at their homes and making indecent comments. The Electric and Gas Board issued a statement telling women to ask to see an identification card before allowing someone inside their property. Women in Coventry and Birmingham were asked to report any sightings of the man immediately. Due to the leather patches on his overcoat, he was believed to have worked in transport or as a lorry driver. Roadside cafes throughout the Midlands were canvassed, as were transport depots. Each home that the man had called at was examined by a fingerprint expert from Scotland Yard, Superintendent Taffy Drew. In Birmingham, Mary Smith, who lived on Rendell Road with her 3 children, believed that a man matching the same description had called at her home and told her he was there to inspect the meter. She noticed he had no tools with him. He said he didn't know where the meter was because they were in different places in these new houses, but I was suspicious because I know they are all under the stairs. Then he asked me to go up the stairs in front of him. I told him to go up himself. When he came down, he asked if my husband was home, talked to the baby and started making remarks about my figure. I was so frightened I was going to knock on the wall to my neighbour, but he went soon after that. Detectives believe the man was associated with a green or blue lorry with the word Cooper on the side. On January 20th, the man called at a number of properties on the same street in Birmingham. One homeowner, Constance Thomas, said, "When the man called, he stood in the centre of the room and kept looking all around him. Then he looked straight at me and said, 'Have you just got out of bed?' I couldn't think of any reason why he should ask me that because I was fully dressed and doing the housework. Then he said he wanted to check the meter, and I asked him what was the time. When he said it was 11:30, I said I would have to go out and get the children from school. This gave me my excuse to get away. I went and told a policeman who was patrolling the children across the road at Warwick Road schools." Constance's neighbour Kathleen Bradbury explained that the man had grinned furiously at her when he was in her home. Edna Birch, who lived a few doors down, said, "The strange thing about this man was that he stood all the while with his hands in his overcoat pockets. He stood by the back door and asked where the meter cupboard was. I showed him. He still kept his hands in his pockets and I had to open the cupboard for him. As I did so, he stood close behind me, and for the first time I began to wonder whether something was radically wrong. He then said he wanted to go into the bedroom and see the lights, but I refused to let him do so. At that time, I suddenly saw a van go past quite quickly, and it occurred to me to use it as a pretext for getting rid of him." Other women also revealed that the man asked them to go upstairs with him to check the lights, but they refused. When he came back downstairs, he said good morning to them before leaving. Carlo Mogano believed that Penelope was just the right person to deal with the bogus inspector, and she would not have been intimidated by him. Carlo added, "My wife was a lovely woman. She kept no secrets from me. We shared everything. All her friends were my friends. She did not have an enemy in the world. I thought the killer might have been someone with a jealous motive from inside our dancing circle, but now I am certain that this is out of the question. Certainly there have been petty jealousies. The petrol rags thrown through my dancing instructor's pantry window and then onto my car in November may have resulted from these jealousies, but I think it ended there." Investigators came to learn that the Moganos had fostered a 6-year-old until a few months before the murder, and police were checking with social workers to see if there was any link. Penelope had also recently retired from the Radford Towns Women's Guild when she said she was too tired in the afternoons. A member of the guild told the Coventry Evening Telegraph, "At about the same time she gave up the guild, she sent back to a home the little foster girl Barbara, a lovely child, always beautifully clean and well dressed. I remember on one occasion we had a talk by an official who remarked that Mrs. Mogano was a good example of what could be done to give a child a good home. A private funeral service attended by 15 members of Penelope Mogano's immediate family was held at Canley Crematorium on January 25th. Penelope and Carlo's sons were not in attendance because they were thought to be too overwhelmed to cope. The funeral had been pushed forward by 2 hours to ensure it was as private as possible. Hundreds of people would later arrive to pay their respects before realizing they had missed the service. While the funeral was small, members of old-time dance organisations across the Midlands sent wreaths to be laid out in the Garden of Remembrance in Penelope's honour. They were organised to form a cross. A questionnaire was sent out to over 1,500 homes in the area, asking what they knew about the victim. Some neighbours claimed they saw Penelope leaving her home most afternoons, leading to speculation that she had a secret life her husband knew nothing about. Investigators thought that information was being withheld. Chief Constable John Edmonds stated, "Someone is shielding the murderer. We are still interested if anybody who knows anything at all about Mrs. Mogano would come forward. We are particularly interested in what she did in the afternoons." Over 70 detectives had been assigned to the case, and they began to focus on tracing Penelope's movements in the weeks before her death. Chief Constable Edmonds went on to say, "We have heard nothing to her discredit yet. She may not have had a secret at all. Her trips may have been ordinary visits to town, but there are still some blank statements." Carlo refused to accept that his wife had been expecting a male companion on the afternoon she was murdered. He returned to the house with his oldest son, while his youngest was staying elsewhere. Carlo said, "There is in my mind a fear that whoever killed my wife has a grudge against the family as a whole and may attempt to injure my son. Michael is never out of my sight, and Adrian, I feel, is safer with friends." If losing his wife wasn't enough, Carlo had to publicly defend himself from rumours that he had something to do with Penelope's death. In an interview with The People, he said, "I know about the rumour going around Coventry. I know what they are whispering, but I am innocent. I did not bother to establish an alibi. The police have found one for me. It gives me a complete explanation of my movements on the afternoon of the crime." Carlo had been at work 10 minutes away from the house, and his alibi had been corroborated by the security officers at the factory. Also, his boss confirmed he hadn't left. Carlo added, "If I had left the works in my overalls, the security officers would have stopped me. If I had put on my street clothes over my overalls, someone would have recognized me by my heavy-rimmed glasses and mustache. I know that a husband is often one of the first persons suspected, so I voluntarily handed over my overalls and working tool to the police to be tested for traces of blood." Carlo attempted to clear up any confusion about why a uniformed officer was standing outside his house and explained, "He's there at my request, to protect my sons." Carlo was frustrated by the rumours and went on to say, "I have no secrets and nothing to hide from anyone. I have not the faintest idea who hated my wife enough to do this terrible thing. I think the stories of jealousy and feuds in the old-time dancing club my wife and I belonged to have been exaggerated. We were amateur dancers just interested in relaxation and having a good time. Tell the rumour mongers that I'm ready to answer any question. to do anything that will bring my wife's murderer to justice." There were reports that items of clothing belonging to several unidentified men and women were sent to the West Midlands Forensic Science Laboratory for analysis, as was a blood-stained handkerchief that had been found a few hundred yards from the scene. Frustratingly, nothing of evidentiary value was found, and the handkerchief was identified as belonging to someone who used it after a trip to the dentist. A week after the murder, bloodstains were discovered in a telephone kiosk 400 yards from Penelope's home. A witness had told the police, "At 4:25 p.m. the day of the murder, I was sitting in a car outside a newsagent's in Heathcote Street. There was a man in the telephone box and he appeared to be making a call. A few seconds later he came out and stood by the bonnet of the car. His right hand was covered with what I would describe as a tea cloth. It was wrapped around the hand in a bulky fashion as if it had been done in haste. He had his right hand to his left cheek and held it there while he looked up and down the road. Suddenly he made off at a run across some waste ground towards Kersley." The man was described as being around 30 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall with a sallow or ill complexion. He had sunken cheeks and was wearing a dark-coloured trilby hat and a navy blue loose-fitting overcoat. He had a pointed chin and was believed to have had a scar or abrasion on the right side of his face. A man matching that description had been seen thumbing a lift. He had got onto the back of a large orange-coloured lorry carrying girders to London. Long-distance lorry drivers were questioned and asked if they had seen the man the police were searching for. Glass panels from the telephone kiosk were taken away for analysis, as were the receiver and telephone book. The framework of the kiosk was then dusted for prints before being covered with tarp to preserve any evidence. A small sample of blood was found on the telephone book, but it was later identified as belonging to one of the investigating officers who had been in the booth. Disappointingly, nothing that could be linked to the murder was found. The hitchhiker was identified in Peckham and was brought back to Coventry for questioning. He was released not long after, as there was no evidence to tie him to Penelope Mogano's murder. Without any solid leads, investigators turned to a Birmingham-based medium named Mary Brooks. She said the killer was a man who had since left the Midlands, and that the murder weapon was a paperweight that had been tossed into stagnant water. At a séance, Mary described the person responsible as an aging man who did his best to look youthful. Allegedly, people knew him for his dapper appearance and love of dancing. Mary Brooks added, "He is such a meek little man. Never did any harm to anyone. He never said a word out of place. Like steps, he does. The steps he understands." The killer carried a paperweight in the right-hand pocket of his overcoat. The right pocket will be blood-stained. You are looking for a dismal little dog made of brass. One of those dismal little dogs that sits up, that likes to worry, and has a lined face. By April 1954, 7,000 people had completed the police questionnaire sent to homes in the area. It asked local residents their date of birth, their height, whether there were any regular callers to their home, the reason for them calling, the date and time of their visits, and whether there were any visitors on January 18th, the day of the murder. The questionnaire then asked, "Do you know Mrs. Mogano? Did you see her on January 18th? Have you seen her with anyone other than her family?" Approximately 25,000 people would be interviewed. A body of water on Scott's Lane was drained of over 200,000 gallons of water in search of the murder weapon, but nothing was found. At an inquest that month, the coroner's jury returned a verdict of willful murder against a person or persons unknown. The mystery of the case was likened to an unsolved murder that happened a decade earlier. In October 1945, 68-year-old pub licensee Amy Davis was found beaten to death in the bath above the Ring o' Bells pub on Yardley Street in Coventry. Cash and jewellery had been stolen, which led the police to believe it was a break-in gone wrong. Because the murder occurred during the war, thousands of soldiers who were stationed in nearby barracks were questioned, but the killer was never found. So where are we now? 1 year on from Penelope Mogano's murder, Chief Constable Pendleton provided an update on the case. Not a day passes without some information coming in. Inquiries continue on several lines, and it is still hoped that one day the vital bit of evidence will come to light. The man posing as a meter inspector was eventually detained after being stopped driving a blue lorry with the word Cooper on the side. He was ultimately cleared of any involvement in Penelope's murder. In August 1956, the police questioned a man and a woman about their initial statements. It was theorized that two people could have attacked Penelope due to the number of injuries and the use of both a knife and a hammer. However, no one was ever charged. Carlo Mogano and his sons moved out of 7 Holland Road a couple of years after the murder. The house was bought by Mrs. G. Peacock, a local shop owner. In January 1959, she was found dead in her bedroom after her employees became concerned when she didn't show up for work. Mrs. Peacock's death was ruled accidental when the pathologist concluded that she had died from inhaling paraffin fumes from her bedroom stove. The coroner presiding over the inquest said, "This house has a rather unfortunate history." Time went by, and Carlo Mogano remarried a woman named Alice in 1961. He passed away in Coventry at the age of 78 in 1986 without ever knowing who killed his first wife. Penelope Mogano's murder remains unsolved. Thank you for listening, and special thanks to our patrons for their support. For more information on this episode, please see the show notes or visit our website, theywalkamonguspodcast.com.